No, I've scared you fuckers. Let's talk about Dungeons and Dragons.
Hello, and welcome to this episode of the Alien Familiar RPG Podcast. I am Clayton.
I'm Jordan.
I am Eliot.
Before we get started, you can find show notes and more at alienfamiliar.com. You can email us at alienfamiliarmedia@gmail.com. We are on Facebook at facebook.com/alienfamiliar. And if you would like to help us out with supporting the show, you can do so at patreon.com/alienfamiliarmedia. So if you enjoy our content and would like to help us out with hosting costs, any help you would be able to give us would be greatly appreciated. Thank you for joining us. Today we are talking about playing a pacifist and any other character concepts that we feel are very difficult to pull off. We'll be giving advice on how to play them to try to ensure fun for yourself and the whole group. I want to give a little caveat here at the beginning. I'm mostly going to be focusing on character concepts that you're intending to play in a long-term campaign. I think that pretty much any character concept can be played in a one-shot and be fun. It's not really much to play a particular character type for 4 to 6 hours, but to come back to some of these concepts week in and week out for dozens and dozens of hours, it can get tedious to play certain types again and again, where particularly in the case of the pacifist, combat, and especially in D&D 5th edition, combat is a major portion of the game, and if you're not participating in combat, that's a big part of the game where you're just kind of sitting there twiddling your thumbs.
Isn't there a cleric archetype that is a pacifist, or is it a monk in 5th edition? I seem to remember there being a build for this. Am I misremembering?
I'm sure there is a build for it. There's always been a build for for pacifist characters. Mostly, I think that cleric is probably the easiest way to go because you've got so many spells and stuff that are based around healing others, buffing others, but most of the other classes, I think it's much more difficult to pull off because you just don't have a lot of options in combat, which in D&D 5th edition is generally a large portion of the game.
You know, a lot of these difficult builds, there's nothing wrong with them in theory. I think the thing that I've noticed that trips people up whenever they make an unconventional build is that, you know, it's typically something that's exciting to them. They're breaking their norm. They're kind of excited, and sometimes it's easy to forget that it's other people's games too, right? So you have to be really mindful of the point of the game, that you're playing a game. Remember that you're playing a game with a purpose. And there's nothing more annoying than the paladin style, lawful good or pacifist kind of. Anytime that if you're pacifist, if it's something they can manage on their own, then that's going to be fun for that character to play through, even in a long-term game. But if it's something where you're offended by the act of violence or something like that, or if there's any expectation on the other part of the party, I've played in a lot of games where people create characters that they think, a character who's going to create conflict is going to be fun. Oh no, I'm going to try to keep combat from happening, or that kind of a pacifist or something like that. That player is the worst. They have the worst time, and that's the worst kind of build you could do. So when I think a pacifist kind of character in a D&D game, think like, a medic, during a wartime, and, that kind of a thing. One that's not put off by the idea of combat, but one that cannot be violent themselves.
Yeah, and a lot of times, this is particularly a pacifist character. It can be something that it's imposing something on the main group that they may not want, especially your example of the paladin who never wants to be the one to initiate combat or whatever, and always wants to go for a peaceful solution first. It is imposing the paladin's will on the party, or it's going to be something where the party is just constantly in conflict against the paladin. And it can be fun for a little while, but it gets stale quick.
I don't think the problem there is that there's party conflict. I think if you don't have party conflict, you've got a really boring game where all of the drama is between player characters and NPCs, which is pretty one-dimensional in my opinion. I think what is shitty about the situation that you guys are describing is when somebody has that sort of, zealot locked-in character and refuses to have any kind of character development around that, regardless of what the circumstances are, what other player characters, do or say in response to it. I definitely push back on the idea that inter-party conflict is directly equivalent to people not having fun.
And I'm specifically not mentioning that because I'm going at it from the perspective that having, like you said, having that same argument. Are we going to fight this guy? No, we're not going to fight them. Yes, we are. Having that conversation every single time you come against an obviously villainous NPC who is there to create conflict for the players. Having that exact same conversation time and time again just gets mind-numbing, boring, and stale.
Yeah, it's along the spectrum, right? You are correct. There's a difference between party members having conflict over, should we trust this NPC? Or, no, I'm not going to take your word for this because the last time you stole, the magic item on my backpack. Party conflict's going to happen over the course of the game, hopefully. But, whenever you're setting out to design a character, it should be a huge red flag to your DM who's advising you and you as a player if, the whole point of the combat system in any game is to adjudicate combat. It's a part of the game. So anytime that you're taking whole chunks of the book, whole chunks of what an RPG is, and you're kind of turning that on its head, you really need to put I think it's very important to be mindful of, just ask yourself the question, what am I going to do to make sure that my fun in this new build is not impeding the fun of my fellow players? That doesn't even mention the fact that a pacifist, say you make that perfect pacifist, and they are just the person that, refuses to do violence themselves. That's hard to handle too. That in and of itself is difficult because then you're going to have to deal with the parties. What if the party needs you to? And there's nothing more annoying to me than just a cleric that heals. Are you going to heal enemies too? You know what I mean? There's lots of even if you do it right, there's lots of opportunities for conflict.
That's what's interesting about those characters to me. Under what circumstances do you break your personal oath or whatever? That's what the interesting story is, and that's where the character growth is. When I'm thinking about this right now, I was thinking about so what happens if you invert the problem in a different setting? And I'm thinking about Star Trek: The Next Generation, and the inverse here would be Mr. Worf. Klingon, always ready for battle. How many times are they on some away mission? They encounter something that seems the least bit threatening. Worf immediately pulls his phaser, and whoever the commanding officer is has to tell him to stand down every time. I'll bet you can find 60 examples of that across Star Trek: The Next Generation. But it's something about his character that's always being shown there, and I don't get tired of it. It's interesting. It's the thing that I expect Worf to do in those circumstances. And sometimes he does have to fight. And flipping it back the other way, where most characters in a D&D group are closer to Klingons than, Starfleet officers. The one person that's, more introspective or, intellectual in some way and, shies away from violence a whole lot, I think also would have a similarly interesting part to play in that kind of situation. But you're right, Worf never flips out and wide beam phasers the whole away team's fuck this, I'm going at him with a bat'let. You got to figure out how to make your weird thing jive with everybody else.
And that's something that works on a TV show, but often doesn't work in a role-playing game group who hasn't worked this out ahead of time, that this is going to be a major conflict for the characters. I think that the problem with this concept lies in basically imposing this on the other players at the table without them having any say whatsoever in whether or not this is something that they are going to consider fun to deal with session after session.
I do want to push back a little bit on the idea that the thing that's the most interesting about those like pacifist characters is like almost like the inevitability of when are they going to just give it up? You know what I mean? I don't know. I think that if you're going to play that pacifist, I think in my mind, I think it would be more interesting to stick to your guns. Once you do it, you got to do it. And you got to go, there's nothing more like, honestly, especially in the times where I've sat back and watched other people play these kind of like, I don't know what the word would be, these principled characters. Every time at some point when they do eventually throw those principles to the wayside, I'm always like, oh, come on. Now this is the time you choose to ditch it? Screw you, man. Like, in my mind, the party, I think it's the more interesting thing is if you're going to do it, how can you negotiate your character to where you're still enjoying the game and the other players are enjoying the game? But it should really almost become like a thing. When do you get the respect of the party? And maybe like that's the more interesting way, in my opinion. I like to push to see when does the party start to account for this character and respect that aspect of the character because they know that they're so principled. It's not just like, okay, here I'm the pacifist in the murder hobo group. Okay, how many sessions is it going to be till I just irrationally kill somebody? Session 3, okay, guess I'm going to go along now. No, I think that player needs to be thoughtful in how they create their character, but once they've created that character should stay that way. Damn the consequences, right?
I kind of agree. I didn't mean to say that the only interesting thing about them is when they finally snap. The tension is what I meant was the interesting thing about them, and along the way, like what other things are they willing to sacrifice for their own personal code? Like that's a lot of it as well. But
oh yeah, that's that common pitfall that player character, right? Is that inevitably you're going to get in a position where you have to do violence to help somebody else, and then once a player chooses not to help another player because of some sort of like moral code, oh god, that's like, danger, party in jeopardy, game in jeopardy.
I literally think those hard decisions is what you were asking for, like explicitly when you choose to play a character like that. If those kinds of decisions don't come up, then you could have played anything. And it's in wrestling with those things that you get to display who your character is. And, that's the difference between like a Bruce Lee monk and, Kane from Kung Fu Monk.
Yeah, but the murder hobos don't. That's the thing. It's not so much on your part that it's going south. I think there's the murder hobo type player that is in every party. If that is more than one or two of your players, you run a real risk of those players not accepting. Then it gets. We've all seen it. People go in strange directions whenever they get frustrated with another party member, and if you're the type of player that treats every role-playing game like a consequence-free day, then sometimes the party can go south. And whenever they see a pacifist character kind of, not making things easy for them.
I also think that characters that have some built-in, difficulty to playing them like this is something that people want to play often after they've played a while and they know what, like, the standard fighter, standard wizard plays like, then you want to like fuck with the formula some. That's how I am anyway. That I've done this for years and years and years, and I'm bored to death of your cookie cutter pre-built kind of characters. So I look for ways to do things that are challenging, and I don't think that's I don't know. I don't think that's the problem that usually comes up. Like, I guess if you've got a new character that doesn't know how to make that jive, yeah. But when you've got an interesting character like that and you're going into it with the knowledge that you're basically walking in with leg weights on purpose as far as your option space in the game, you have to get really, really creative with how you're going to handle stuff. If you just go in without any kind of plan or, any mindset that you're going to have to be like really inventive from situation to situation, improvise a lot, you're going to fall flat on your face and it's going to suck, and you very well might just flip out and, kill people in the case of a pacifist or whatever. And like you said, Eliot, just take the cheap way out and pretty much let all the air out of your character concept right from the jump. Clayton, do you remember the pacifist monk I played in your game in Sigil in help me out. My brain's
in the Planescape game?
Yeah. That was so difficult trying to figure out what to do about all sorts of different encounters that we would have. Like everything from just like people who, for people who don't know Planescape, the factions in that game are pretty much like are wrapping around some kind of ideology that is sort of taken to a kind of crazy extreme in all cases. And so we come across people that were like completely devoted to just chaos, for instance, or, if we'd fight something that like wasn't even something you could negotiate with, some kind of like objectively evil undead thing or whatever the hell. That is really hard to handle as a pacifist monk. And so I had to come up with all kinds of different ways to deal with it. So I don't know. It's like playing on hard mode for yourself on purpose, I think.
Yeah, and in that particular campaign, which is something I've seen a couple of times with particularly pacifist characters, that was also a small group. I want to say at the time that there were four there were four players, and usually one player didn't show, so it was really a 3-party game, or a 3-person party. And if one person is a pacifist, then basically in combat you are a 2-person party, and that is incredibly hard to balance, and especially in D&D 5th edition.
Well, hang on now. That's not how I remember it being. I remember keeping a lot of enemies occupied during combat. I was never like sitting on the sidelines and letting my teammates get ganged up on. I just wasn't bashing in skulls. I was like tripping people, getting them entangled in stuff, like, wrestling or whatever it was, getting them to chase me away from where the combat was happening.
All of that is true, yes, but the fact is that in D&D 5th edition, it is assumed that each player character is going to be dishing out X amount of damage in a round, or on average per round. And if one player isn't, makes the encounters very difficult to balance out from the GM's perspective anyway.
Well, we've talked a lot about the pacifist, but I think the exact opposite character is the more difficult. If you're there's nothing more difficult to play than an absolute chaotic character. To be honest with you, I haven't done that too much. It's been a long time since I've played with a absolute sociopath. What have your guys' experience been with characters who are just designed to be unpredictable?
I did that exact thing in that same game as a separate character. It was the same campaign, wasn't it, Clayton? Or was it?
Yes, it was.
Okay, I thought so.
I would like to add that, yes, that you did do that, but I actually had a player who went one step further than what you did. He played a character who he literally didn't do anything unless he made a chart to roll a die on to see what he did. A good choice, a neutral choice, an evil choice, and then he rolled on that chart.
How'd that pan out?
It was absolute chaos.
Did it ruin the game?
Absolutely. The character ended up having to get retired because he decided to drop a fireball just in the middle of a market.
That's a weird thing to force that decision. Like, how did that even come up that he decided he should roll on that? Like, there seems like there's a little bit selection bias on how you even determine what is worthy of a role or not.
Well, they needed to create a distraction, so he decided, I will create a distraction, and he made a distraction list of a good, a neutral, and an evil act, and the evil act was drop a fireball.
I see.
And then immediately afterward, literally everyone in town, including the other PCs, were going at him.
Understandably.
Yeah, I mean, chaotic doesn't mean stupid, right? Like, is that? Let's talk about that for a second. Just because your character's chaotic doesn't mean your character is an idiot, right?
Stupid should be a very definite alignment in D&D. I think it should be an extra axis.
Well, you have that. It's your intelligence and your wisdom attributes. Like those, they're there. That's accounted for.
Well, there's not intelligent, and then there is this chaotic stupid and lawful stupid on the other end of the spectrum that is probably the most disruptive style of play I've ever encountered. Just because it's the type, it's maybe not stupid, but just stubborn about, I am just going to do things my way and to hell with everyone else about literally everything. I am only ever going to do this one thing, and I am never ever going to change from it. Nothing that happens in the game is going to make me change my mind and do anything else. It's the classic static character who never grows or changes.
I've never been a big fan of chaotic characters, playing them or playing with them, but playing them is just because I have a hard time. I don't know what they would be. I have a hard time putting myself in that headspace.
All right, I will go ahead. So whenever I play a chaotic character, and by chaotic I mean with the big C in D&D, where it actually means something. I always have some sort of underlying principle that my character is adhering to. I know that's not chaotic, but you kind of have to have something grounding yourself to put reason to madness. And a lot of the chaotic stupid and lawful stupid characters that I've seen over the years, they have that underlying thing, but it's just so unchanging. It doesn't ever, I mean, going back to my example of the guy who randomly rolled every time he was faced with any sort of a decision, he adhered to that regardless of how it was going to affect the campaign as a whole, whether or not it was going to be fun for the other player characters, whether or not they were going to get any enjoyment out of the game. He was going to play his character the way he wanted to play it. And that goes the same way for what I consider lawful stupid, which is very often the classic paladin idea of, I'm always going to do what is right and just, and I will never even entertain hearing about the rogue slipping off to pick a lock type of characters that is just so rigid. And I guess the thing that I'm railing most against is somebody who just doesn't care about how actions play out. They don't care about how the consequences will play out, in that they're not going to allow that to change or grow how their character would change living through those life events. Because, I mean, life events change everybody. What you go through in life molds who you are.
The Stern Brought Blades from Dragonlance, I think, has always been my stereotype example of a lawful stupid character.
I tend to think of the lawful and chaotic spectrum when I'm thinking about how it applies to the character I'm playing. I always think about it as like sort of from rational to emotional, something like that, or like, from premeditated to impulsive, something along those lines. 'Cause, you can have a very methodical, lawful, evil character that's doing as terrible shit or worse as anything that a chaotic evil character is capable of doing. I mean, potentially it could be much, much worse, because the scope of what a really chaotic character is capable of doing is kind of limited to like what's immediately in their power. They generally don't have the ability to, put together a grand scheme and involve a bunch of other people. Like there's way too much planning and management and all that in that sort of thing. And on the good side, it's like, the wry grin Robin Hood sort of character that, just does whatever seems right at the time and so on. So that's the way I think about it. I don't think about it so much as like sanity versus madness, but just, an ordered mind versus like a very, easily swayed kind of. Does that make sense?
Yeah. And I really like that spectrum, that dichotomy that you just said about the, damn it. You just said it a few, 30 seconds ago. Now I can't remember exactly what you said. The ordered mind versus the impulsive mind.
Yeah, and that really shows that maybe the most difficult character to abide in a game would be a chaotic, neutral kind of person, because you're not really tied to being good or bad. It's like whatever you feel like at the time. And then if you throw in the impulsivity, those characters can be difficult to deal with. Those characters, I mean, I know we're getting a little far afield here, but they're difficult to play, right? You know what I mean?
Yeah. I don't know. I mean, this is, like, if we really get too much into psychoanalysis of the D&D alignment system, it starts getting, like, pretty murky pretty quick. It's very, very limited. And, like, do you assume that most people are true neutral? Like, where do most people fall on this spectrum? And if most people are not true neutral, is it really a balanced spectrum? Like, what the hell are we even talking about? And then...
Well, this would be a good... You're right. And I think we've even done this a couple times just since I've been on the pod. I'm curious, before we get too far afield here, you had written down a few different character types that you felt were similarly difficult to play as the pacifist, and I couldn't help but notice you put the slut on here. I have recently, in the last year or so, played with a group where one of the characters intentionally played a whore. And it was quite a fun character that they played, but it was at times difficult to be with. What have your experiences?
It's easy to be with a whore.
Why did you put that down there, Clayton? I'm curious.
Well, first I want to put I have a distinction in my mind between slut and whore. A whore does things for money, and a slut does things to feel good. So that's my distinction between a slut and a whore.
Okay, I got you.
The reason why I put the slut on here as a style of pacifist is because that style of character is not only is their first impulse to try to seduce literally everything that the party comes across. That's the only thing that matters to them. And I've encountered a couple of slut characters in my time, one of which was actually played by me. And in my personal experience of having played it, I got maybe 3 sessions into it before I was just bored of the character. It wasn't fun anymore to be this character who only wanted to seduce anything that had the creature type in the monster manual.
The only people I've seen play this with any success or longevity, I don't know that there's any way to play it with success. It gets so cringy so fast. But are just actual sluts.
Can't fake it.
I mean, because there's a certain amount of like tone deaf, cringy, cringiness that you have to tolerate, and I just feel like people who are naturally inclined to be that way typically have that button turned off in their brains already, whereas people who are not inclined to be that way are just like it just wouldn't be very fun. I'm not. I would never make a character like that. I don't see how anybody would have any fun out of that, because frankly, it's a role-playing game. If you want to get, your jollies off, just go find somebody to get your jollies off with. You know what I mean? Like, I've never understood the fun of the juvenile, like, sexual aspect of RPGs people inevitably want to pull into it. It's like, talk about the wrong place, wrong time. I mean, I could see how it could be fun if you play it right, but I don't know, maybe we should talk about that. How can that be a fun way to play a character?
Well, the only times I've ever seen, like, I've seen each one of these examples that I posted. I've seen at least one example of it actually done right. And usually it is whenever there is a larger party than just your 4 or 5 character group. It's usually a larger group, and this one character there's so many other people at the table that one character's shtick doesn't seem like it just dominates the table. And that's my core criticism of most of the time the pacifist character, is that it ends up just dominating the headspace of the game because it's something that is always at the forefront. It comes up every time there's a combat or every time that there's a new interaction. Going back to what Jordan had said earlier about how, like, if you're going to play the same character who is unchanging, that's where it gets boring. That's where it gets not fun, where you're not allowed to grow.
You also got to have more than just one thing going on. Like, I played a pretty fucking slutty character in Kyle's last game, and he's fucking like libertine, like swashbuckler kind of guy. It wasn't the main thing about him, but it was definitely a thing about him. Anytime that we were in a tavern or whatever, if there's somebody to bang, he's banging him. It literally took up no role playing time. It was just like, what do you do in your off time? I don't know. Try to get drunk and get laid, I guess. Like, maybe steal some coins somehow. I don't know. Get in a fight. Whatever. Yeah, it's like...
So you're saying don't play a slut, don't play a pacifist. Play a slutty pacifist.
I like what you said, Jordan. Like, don't play the one trick pony, because that's where this idea falls apart. If that's the only thing that your character is, mm-hmm. It becomes not fun, because your marquee character, he was a male slut, but he was also like, he was trying to bang every chick, but he was also trying to duel every person who had a sword.
Yeah. There was lots of other shit going on too. Like, we were involved in political intrigues and like trying to figure out mysteries, and me and you were getting into it over shit and whatever the fuck else. Like, it was not in like the top maybe 3 things that are of immediate priority to that character. It's like, that's the stuff you do when you got nothing else to do, and that says something about who you are in itself, but it's not gonna like, drag other people some direction that they don't want to go.
See, but that's so true, and yet like you would think that's obvious, but I've seen so many games and players just do that. They make their characters monolithic, and I mean, I have the cringy experiences I'd had watching other people play the sexually loose characters, or like, that is everything. Like, they try to solve everything with their genitals. You know what I mean? Mm. Just like having, to make the party bend up in pretzels to accommodate your pacifist or lawful stupid characters. I mean, that's typically, if anything, what I think we're going to keep talking about, is that really the problem is making your character one-dimensional, and especially if you make that one-dimensional aspect very difficult for the other party members. That's the recipe for disaster. If you're going to make a character that has this strong and somewhat inconvenient aspect about them, make them well-rounded and worth being around in some other way.
I think there's also, something to be said about the DM's role in some of this as well. I think that it's important to give players, give characters downtime space to do stuff that they want to do that's only of interest to them, and then also have the main storyline stuff that everybody's participating in. That way you can have your personal imagination sandbox in the game to make whatever you want out of your character's life and career, without having to take anything away from anyone else. I think that, when you try to have every single person in the game all these personalities crammed into a dungeon tunnel the entire time within 10 feet of each other, no matter what, like, man, that's rats in a cage. Like, anybody that is even slightly oriented towards individualism is eventually going to chafe under those kind of circumstances. That's a walking prison. So yeah, I think you need to give people some slack to be creative.
Yeah, I 100% agree. I've run into that as a game master a lot of, like, whenever I'm sitting at the table and I'm constantly worried about whether or not people are having fun, and it's really difficult to see whether or not people are having fun because not everybody has fun in the same way. Not everybody needs to be engaged directly with what's going on for them to have fun. And it's really difficult for me to see that, especially on like the stereotypical wallflower type player where they are there mostly to watch the other people play, and they'll put in their little bit whenever it comes their turn in the initiative or whenever it comes their turn on the around the table. That's where I run into the problem of, like Jordan, you said, like having this campaign constantly be on some sort of a trajectory toward an end and not giving the players enough time to breathe and to literally do their own thing and develop their characters in a way that's not directly applicable to the plot that is going on. Yeah,
it makes me feel like I'm on a fucking chain gang. Like, it's terrible. And, everybody's in everybody else's business because we're all, within a move action of each other at all times. And, you just can't do anything personal. You're all just playing like, this giant Megazord fucking math machine, and that's fine sometimes, but everybody needs some alone time. It's okay.
Do they?
Fuck do you mean, do they?
Well, I mean, alone time. I just noticed that one of the other suggestions on it is like talking about the lone wolf character and how that can be very disruptive. I just in my own head, I'm thinking about, like, I think there's a funny, like, video that, like, a spoof video about D&D that can be made where every time something gets interesting, that one character, like, raises their hand and says, private conversation, can I talk to you privately? My character goes off, you know what I mean? Everybody definitely needs downtime, and there needs to be development that's private. I think every character should be interested enough to have a private side, thing going on with the DM. But the lone wolf is that what you meant by that, Clayton, in your description of the lone wolf? Just the guy that has to constantly dominate the game time?
Yeah, and I want to kind of clarify that kind of what I feel like me and Jordan are talking about is like allowing your characters enough time to, like, basically do their own thing. It's all a part of balance. And my issue with this lone wolf character is that it's the character who is always off on their own. It's another form of the one-trick pony where they always go in alone. They're never a part of the team. I don't think that there's a problem with having, like, downtime where your characters go do things, or having like allowing the group to kind of break up into smaller groups in order to go accomplish something that only their particular skill sets are optimized for, like having all of the talkie players go off and basically scour the city for information, or having all the stealthy characters go off and like basically steal plans that the enemies are crafting or something like that. As long as it's not every single time an obstacle comes up, the lone wolf is like, I can do this on my own. Let me just sneak off into the back and go off and kill this guy all by myself without any of the party, because I don't need them. I am completely self-sufficient and I don't need anybody else in this group game.
I think a lot of the problem with that in as much as it is a problem, is to do with the limitations of most role-playing game systems, like mechanically speaking. Like, I was thinking about this kind of thing a lot after listening to that WebDM episode that I sent you guys about having, sort of mini games within role-playing games. And I think that the reason that shit like that is weird is because when someone does have an idea, I want to go off and try X, Y, and Z, there's nothing mechanical in the rules, or very, very little, that tells the DM how to handle that. And so it takes a bunch of extra time and becomes all of this like stressful improvisation. Meanwhile, everybody else is like phone zoning and like fucking off and whatever, while the DM is trying to figure out how to handle this loose cannon. But I mean, if you think about the game like in a tactical context, it makes perfect sense that you'd have like, let's say in a combat, your main force, your fighter, paladin, whatever, cleric, right there in the core of the group. Well, then you've got a different set of characters that are, specialized for different things. You'll have a rogue that wants to sneak off, a wizard that wants to go invisible and, move around and do like flanking maneuvers or whatever. That shit's gonna come up. Like, you're not running a group full of Vikings. You're running a diverse party with different kinds of skills and specialties. And so, yeah, I think that the pain in the ass of that is just that the game does not accommodate all of the stuff that it allows you to build equally. Does that make sense?
Yeah, I mean, I think that some of that has to do with just like you can't have privacy and you can't be unilateral and have privacy too. That's really what drags the game down. I'm totally cool with a party member if say we're in combat and you're playing a sneaky rogue and there's a combat situation and the rogue wants to go do some snaking around to or whatever within the initiative. That's fine. It's just, I think for the flow of the game, as long as there's an agreement at the table that like it happens still in the flow. What really bogs the game down is the transition between private talk, public talk, private talk, public talk. As long as everybody agrees that stuff's above table, and if anything doesn't need to be known, then the players have to, not metagame, then I think that's perfectly fine. I think that's like, as long as everybody's willing to give that concession, I don't see there anything wrong with the rogue taking a different tack, or it could be anybody, leaving the party, splitting the party, I guess you could say. It's just so often than not people want to split the party, but they also want to keep it private. You know what I mean?
Yeah, and that's the hardest part to do is how do you keep that private? Do you just, there's two options. Either you take the one player and the one GM separate from the main table and they go off into the next room or out on the porch and they do this thing and everybody else is sitting around the table twiddling their thumbs or thumbing through their phone. Or do you sit around the table and you narrate and then the metagame knowledge of all of the other players, they know exactly what's going on and there really isn't real privacy because literally everybody knows what's happening and it becomes impossible then to separate 3 sessions down the line. Okay, what information do I actually know and what did I just overhear because I was sitting around the table whenever this private conversation was happening?
Yeah, I would much rather somebody who's got something that they want to keep secret as a character take the DM aside into, side room or whatever and discuss it there so I never have to spend mental energy to separate what I know from what I don't. If it's out of character information, I don't want to fucking hear it because, like you said, Clayton, I'm not going to remember that shit 3 weeks from now.
Yeah, be that as it may, though, me personally, when I've been the DM, I've liked it better when I think it's just better to have it be known that privacy happens when I say so as the DM. Does that make sense? Because I do think it's good. It's even though it stifles some aspects of the game, the lone wolf needs to be discouraged as much as possible. And if you give a player who's prone to leaving the party or splitting the party, giving them the ability to just stalk the world, you know what I mean, at their whim. If you set that as the precedence, then they're going to be doing it all the damn time. And regardless of the realities of it, or like, well, it would be more realistic if this, and metagaming becomes tough for that. I mean, the reality is every moment that the DM is off with one person, you might as well be playing chess, and everybody else just waiting their turn. And since all RPGs are a naturally social group activity, it should be super rare and for the party, for one player to be able to trigger. I mean, it happens. I mean, I do think it happens, and I can even see occasionally giving in to a player. But as a general rule, I almost feel like it's, especially if you have that player who's just like, it seems like every session they want to drag you away from the table. There's nothing wrong with saying, okay, we can have this private, but say it out loud. I'm not leaving this table every 10 friggin' minutes, or I'm not going to a side chat every 10 minutes or at your whim. That's, you know what I mean? Does that make sense? What do you guys think? Is that too heavy-handed?
I think you're fucking lazy, and on behalf of the lone wolves of the world, I'd just like to say fuck you. I mean, I think the problem is people not getting a fair share of spotlight time. And I don't think it matters how that share, gets spent, whether it's you with the group or you off doing your own thing as a character. I think it's a problem if you're taking more than your slice of the pie. But who fucking gives a shit if the entire session, I'm off fucking around doing recon or whatever. It's probably for the good of the group, at least in part. And I guarantee it's going to, move the story along in one way or the other. And it opens up a ton of story possibilities that aren't there when an entire group is, stomping around as a gang through every encounter. If there's 5 players and I'm trying to get a third of the spotlight time, that's an issue. Cut that shit out. But how the fuck do you set up an interesting situation where a player character gets kidnapped by the enemy, for instance, when you've got all 6 of them fucking bombing around with their, plus everythings and all their spells up and whatever at all times? Like, no. When someone goes off on their own, that's a moment of vulnerability, for one thing, so you can exploit that to your heart's content for story purposes. And also it's profoundly unbelievable to me that every interaction that happens in a role-playing game between a group of people and one NPC is the same as it would be between one person and one NPC. Like, that's just not how people converse, Like, imagine having a conversation with 6 or 7 people that are all completely on the same side and pointing at you. Like, that would be incredibly intimidating and, fucking weird. Like, people open up to each other one-on-one. So there's a whole bunch of, like, narrative stuff that I think is much more interesting solo.
No, I don't disagree with you, because having played with you quite a bit, I know you're prone to splitting the party, and I know you're prone to running off. But as far as what I'm talking about, you're not prone to doing what aggravates me as a player. I mean, if you as a player want to run off and be, sidebarred and held off, that's fine. What I'm saying is that first of all, let's get something straight. We're talking about games where we're playing spells and acting out as heroes. There's absolutely no reason to think that role-playing games need to be realistic. They don't need to be realistic, first of all. Second of all, we are playing, it is a shared experience, and I think that everybody at the table, games work best when everybody at the table respects what we're actually doing, which is volunteering our time to spend together in this social game, and we're playing it together. So, which I can say, I mean, you're not the type of player that I've seen to disrespect everybody's time. But we have all played with that asshole who just, for whatever reason, feels like, their impulsive opportunity to do something secretive, even if it's in the best interest of the party, demands their one-on-one attention. And 20 minutes, 30 minutes, 15 minutes, it's like, I just feel like as a DM, I personally feel like that's best to be discouraged, because frankly, no one person's time at the table is more valuable than anybody else's. And any time that one person takes individual time away from the group, that ought to be, in my opinion, laying the foundation for a very rewarding payoff for the whole party. And it's the DM's job to manage that. And if a player wants to run off and go do fuck all, I don't think that there's anything wrong with the DM basically saying, well, cool, you ran off. Let me resolve all this other shit, and then we'll resolve what happens to you, because, you're 1 and this is 5, and, math. But, that being said, usually it's just typically in short-run games that I've seen that, people who don't tend to respect other people, or have some, like, I remember it happening a lot when I was younger. My DMs would have best friends or good friends or people who want to jump in the game, and they just simply didn't respect everybody else, just as people,
right,
and just other players, and, like, that irks the shit out of me. And I don't play with those people, so luckily nobody I play with does that shit. But if somebody tries to do that when I'm DMing, I try to give them a hard check, like, nah, dog, that's not how this works.
In my opinion, the best practice for handling stuff like this, in all the different ways that I've seen it handled and tried to handle it myself, I would say that if what the player is trying to do is time sensitive and affects the stuff that the other players are doing currently, potentially, then that player can act on a normal combat round and just not physically be located in the same place where everybody else is, but keep the same cadence of actions and the same expectations for your turn length. And with playing on Discord and stuff now, switching over into a private room is fucking easy as shit. If you can't be bothered to do that, come on. It is so much less of a pain in the ass than getting up from the table and climbing over everybody and, forgetting your book and having to get your dice and blah, 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 and go out on the porch. Those days are over, unfortunately. Or if what the players want to do is some long con kind of thing, or that can wait till after the encounter, send it in a text message or whatever the fuck what you want to do. If the DM wants to send back, okay, here's the rolls I need or whatever, do that. It doesn't have to be done synchronously with everything else if that's the case. And it could be as easy as the player character saying, all right, I'm going to disappear for an hour, and then literally in the week between sessions describe what the hell it was that you were doing, and and you can get rolls and stuff then if you want to. But yeah, it's just about not hogging the spotlight or anything. That's pretty much all I have to say on that.
Yeah, I agree.
Yeah, and the way that works best that I've experienced is, like Jordan, like you said, say, okay, this is what I'm doing, but we're going to handle this between sessions. That's an awesome way of handling it. In a game that I started online, about a year ago, when the pandemic started, I set a very hard rule that whenever we met for the game, this is when the group is together. Anything that you're wanting to do by yourself, you need to get with me between sessions, and we will go ahead and do this. This is when you'll do your downtime. This is when you'll do your little individual side missions, or whenever you gather information, or whatever it is that you are wanting to do one-on-one or with another player character. We'll set aside the time outside of the regular game time in order to take care of. For a lot of people, especially because this was done online, it worked out really well, because there's going to be times when everybody just has a couple minutes to just sit at the computer and handle this. It's a lot harder to do whenever you're in physical space, because the issue of everybody being there, I'm constantly aware of everybody being there and not everybody having something to do. That's the biggest thing that I rail against whenever somebody is doing the lone wolf thing and they're always going off on their own. As long as we can break it up and have distinct chunks where this is alone time, this is group time. As long as we can define these ahead of time. And you can even do it in session where, like, warn the players ahead of time, like, okay, this session or next week's session, we're going to be handling a bunch of individual things. So everybody come prepared to deal with having time where you're not in the spotlight, where you're not physically present in what is going on in the story, so that everybody has a chance to basically come up with their own story. And if they don't come up with their own story and come up with their own thing that they're going to be doing, well, every player has the responsibility to bring the game equally. And if you're not bringing the game, well, I mean, I warned you that this is going to happen.
Yeah, there's way worse problems than having players that are so into your game that they want to go do individual shit and are like thinking about it between sessions.
Absolutely. Like, whenever I'm GMing and I've got a player like that, that's what keeps the steam in my engine for the campaign. Like, I run out of steam I run out of the energy to run a game if I don't get any feedback from the players that this is a game that they're thinking about between sessions.
Mm-hmm. And as I'm thinking about this, like, I see this bottom point that you mentioned about the one shot, one kill snipers. I think this goes hand in hand. This is something that I bash my head against all the time playing a lot of games. When you've got an idea of some quick way, maybe not quick, but some decisive way to solve a problem, and often there's violence involved, but not always. And the game system just literally makes it impossible for you to do the thing that you want to do. It's my favorite thing in role-playing games, like figuring out some way to like sneak around the back and like blah blah blah. Everybody else is like, you know, in a big brawl or whatever, and use that distraction time to get to the big bad and fucking cut his throat when no one's looking. So often impossible. I find this with the sniper thing, like you mentioned. You know, guns are hardly ever as good as they should be. Sneak attacks are pretty much never as good as they should be. Bombs are really fucking hard to like actually kill something with. Poison is fucking terrible. The 5th edition poison is a joke. And I mean, I think nobody in the history of 5e Dungeons and Dragons worlds has ever been poisoned to death. At least not by the poison that's available to purchase. Stuff like that really fucking pisses me off when you've got a really good like tactical plan to execute, and then just because of the way that some game designer decided to stack this column of numbers against this other column of numbers, this thing that's perfectly reasonable and happens in real life, you know, is just something that you literally can't accomplish just by virtue of game math. What do you think, Eliot?
You know, I don't know. I'm probably not going to give a satisfying opinion, but once again, you know, in theory, yeah, in the real world, there's people who pop people's heads off in one shot. And there are definitely super lethal games where I think that's pretty close to happening, but, you know, just thinking about it in terms of this is a game, and anything that a player can do to an NPC, you have to accept that they could probably do to a player character as well. I don't know. Like, I'm catchy about that. I mean, you know, I think, you know, I think of DMing games and creating, like when I'm thinking about writing or making a game, is, you know, it is more cinematic and movie-like. You know, I mean, how many times should all the characters from Star Wars be dead because stormtroopers can't shoot anything? That's one of those things where in practice it just could be very limiting fun-wise. You know, that being said, I think there's a way to pull it off. I think D&D tried to do it with their minions. I think was it in 4th edition, where they tried to make a class of NPC that was just fodder. And I could see a way of designing a game where maybe you could make tiered bad guys, where, as that could even be a part of your character's power. Is that I'm thinking kind of like Skyrim. I'm playing a lot of Skyrim right now, and there's spells you can do that make bad guys run away if they're under a certain level. Like, I could see a smart game, managing to have different tiers of bad guys, so that whenever you as a PC, that's something you're working towards, is being able to one-shot, headshot kill or something like that. Do a particularly powerful attack that's satisfying, but doesn't break the game. I just think I haven't seen it done yet. I bet it's possible. I haven't really seen it done well. And to me, it's just one of those things where it's like, that's just a limitation of tabletop RPGs.
It's not a limitation of all of them. It's a limitation of a lot of them. And I don't think that the lack is in the types of bad guys or whatever. Like, yeah, I agree the Minions was definitely an attempt to like do something like that. But like, I think the problem is in the like circumstance-based modifiers to things. Like in 5th edition, the fact that only rogues get any kind of bonus damage to sneak attacks is preposterous. And, if I sneak up on whoever the big bad guy is while they're asleep and want to cut their throat, assuming that this is like a normal, mortal human being, regardless of, how great of a fighter they are or however much arcane knowledge they might have or what have you, if you get somebody in a position of complete vulnerability like that, it should be automatic that you can kill them effortlessly. And, you can set up similar circumstances where this falls apart as well. Having somebody lined up in like a sniper shot. Come on, like, you either shot him in the face or you didn't. And I think that the metaphor that they're trying in things like D&D and other systems that have a lot of hit points, or try to make it difficult for people to be killed quickly, they're wanting that back and forth, swashbuckling, like tense kind of combat, where it could go either way for multiple scenes for cinematic reasons, and they don't want just quick kills for the monsters or for the more often not for the PCs, but not all circumstances are like that. I really liked how way back in the revised D20 Star Wars role-playing game, remember they had wound points that were equal to your constitution, and then you had vitality points that went up every level like hit points do in 5th edition. But if you got critted, or if you got hit in some way where there was no reasonable way for you to be able to kind of roll with the blow or whatever to try to defend yourself, it's going to your wound points, and it's much, much, much easier to kill you if you're going straight to wound points than vitality points, right? So like, there's mechanical ways to do it. I just wish that I would like to be rewarded as a player for having a good plan that should work. That's pretty much it. Like, mechanically rewarded, I mean.
Yeah, I remember that system. It was great. And why it hasn't been replicated more, I don't know. Yeah, it was good, and I think it touches on exactly what you're talking about. I mean, if I had to put myself in the position of, like, say, D&D, I think we all know that D&D has found success because of its simplicity, its name and its name recognition. So, I mean, we often talk about D&D because it's what I've played the most. It's what Clayton prefers to play or has played a lot of. We all have played a lot of D&D. And so our depth of knowledge on that particular system is easy to speak comfortably on. But we also know that, anytime that you gear towards simplicity for entry-level players, you're also sacrificing complexity, and those types of mechanics require a kind of an extra step of complexity, which I just think that the industry in general has attached to, I don't know, maybe less lucrative sales. I don't know. I mean, I think that D&D being such a big hit in the last 4 or 5 years, again, seeing this big resurgence, there's definitely a bias towards simplicity on the business side. That's why the less well-traveled games, I think, are the ones that I'm more interested in playing these days and learning about, and they're also the ones that are kind of a little harder to find because they don't have as big a player base.
I don't know if 5th edition's quite as simplistic as you're making it out to be. I mean, considering what's out there in the realm of like simplistic games in the indie role-playing game space, D&D is still I would argue, on the more complex end of things. They just spread it out over a ton of different character build options, different character paths, rather than having a lot of things that are available to all players. They've got a bunch of totally separate, though arguably mostly reskinned, individual class abilities split between how you make your character. But
yeah, they walk the tightrope. I mean, I think they walk their tightrope. But but as far as the universal rules go, I mean, I think that they've tried to make it as simple. I think the goal has been to make it as simple as possible to where new players aren't ran away, because a lot of people who are picking up D&D and buying the books are new to the genre.
Yeah, I could just see a lot of people being disappointed because we've discussed this several times before. There's like the promise that you can do whatever you want, but then you've got this idea of how things ought to work because you've lived in a world and like you know how things ought to work, and then you try to do that thing that seems like it makes sense. Like, oops, you bounced off of one of the rule walls that's invisible sort of around this, strange physics that's defined in this Dungeons and Dragons mechanical system. Sorry, you can't actually cut someone's throat and kill them. They're much too high level for that. What? The dude's asleep. Sorry, he's got hit points. Roll a d4. Fuck you. I don't know. I could see new people getting really turned off. Like, well, fuck this game. This doesn't make any sense anyway. I've certainly been pissed, especially when you make a character like we were talking about around, doing sneaky shit and like, having those like sort of covert orientations of one kind or another, be it a sniper, be it a backstabby assassin or what have you. It's not going to shake out the way that you want most of the time. And when it does shake out for the shitty little one-hit die villains, it's never as important as when you want it to be for, when you're actually sneaking in to assassinate the big bad. Nobody sends an assassin after, the guard at the front door. They send the assassin after the lord of the manor, and that guy just has too many hit points to assassinate. So what's the fucking point of having an assassin in the first place? That's kind of what I'm saying with why that sort of character is on this list of difficult things to play.
Yeah, for sure. And I feel you.
Absolutely agree. Unfortunately, D&D isn't designed to be everything. It's designed to be D&D, and like my philosophy with it is that either you learn how to do it within the rules, or you hope that your GM is going to be flexible enough that they'll roll with real world application, which isn't always the case. And I will be the first to admit that I'm the DM who will not always bow to what the real world says over the rules.
Yeah, me too. I'm kind of leaning on your side too, Clayton, if I can. I like for my players to just know the book well enough to know what you can't do, and then unfortunately make your character that's going to get you the most fun within the bounds of the game. But in those situations, it's like, there's always unintended consequences, not to continue to beat this dead horse, but I can't help but remembering that situation where, say if you set the precedence that a sleeping character, if you, say I'm going to slit their throat, then they just die. And then you get into a similar but not exactly the same situation like we were in, where a party member was being ransomed or held hostage, and the MP, the bad guy. I mean, we had an NPC where Strahd wanted a character. That was like, well, I'm going to cut this character's throat, well, as a GM, I'm never going to let one player just coup de grace another player, if I can help it. So there's always, you have to worry about unintended consequences when you start bending the rules.
Yeah, I think we could probably talk on this subject for a good while longer. So I think I'll put this in on the list of topics to talk about in the future. So let's go ahead and move on to geek things because we're starting to get a little long. Does anybody else want to go first for geek things?
Yeah, I just started watching a new show on Netflix called Sweet Tooth. I guess it's based on a DC comic book I've never heard of before. But I knew literally nothing about it except for the little blurb about it on Netflix. It's like a post-apocalyptic thing after, a pandemic virus, so relatable content. And all these weird little hybrid kids start getting born around the same time, and it's about this one kid that's like sort of like a half deer. But he grows up out in the woods and with his dad, and then the real world comes calling, the call to adventure and so on. So he's checking out the world with this huge guy who's like a ideal survival warrior type of dude. I can't remember the actor's name, but he was I remember him in Game of Thrones. He was the leader from whatever that city was that Daenerys went to in the east that had had all the weird mages and stuff like that. I can't remember the guy's name. Anyway, I'm fumbling identifying this dude, but it's a fucking cool show. I'm like 4 episodes into it, and I think there's 8 in the first season. Very, very good. Check it out. It's well done. I love me some post-apocalyptic stuff. So
yeah, man, that show's getting the push. It looks really cool.
Eliot, you want to go next?
I want to shout out a classic podcast. Probably everybody's familiar with it. If not, then go check it out. It's called The Skeptic's Guide to the Universe. It's ran by a group of brothers who are involved in the skeptical community, and they've had this podcast now for 16 years. There's basically 3 brothers, a friend, and then they're the Novella brothers, and they're all, and a lady named Cara Santa Maria and Evan Bernstein. They're all just skeptic scientific communicators, and every week they publish a podcast that's about science primarily, but also about debunking pseudoscience. And I really tuned into their podcast a lot during COVID, and they were a big help. And I don't know, it's just a great podcast. I wanted to give them a shout out. I've listened to them for a long time. And if I've already done this before, then let me know and I'll do a different one. Because I couldn't remember if I'd shouted it out before or not.
I don't think you have. My geek thing is also a podcast. It's a podcast I recently discovered. It is called Behind the Bastards. It is a history podcast about just a bunch of awful people and going into who they are and why they are awful. It's not just people. It's also organizations, and in some instances like governments and government agencies, like how they became who they are. It mostly focuses on 20th century and the current century, but it's basically throughout the world, like just different groups and different people. I've been listening to a mini series that they've got about the origins, the racist and labor breaking origins of the police that I'm currently listening to. It's really good. So if you're interested in history and want to hear how the modern day police has its roots in both the gangs who went around capturing escaped slaves, and also in the groups who were organizing labor back in the early 1800s, definitely give it a listen to. All right, guys, what do you say we stop this bullshit and start rolling some dice?
Why the fuck do I have to roll? He's asleep.
This has been a production of Alien Familiar Media. You can find past episodes and more at alienfamiliar.com. You can email us at alienfamiliarmedia@gmail.com. This production is protected under a Creative Commons non-commercial attribution, no derivatives license. Music for this episode is Suburban Outlaw by Forget the Whale and can be found at freemusicarchive.org.